What do people misunderstand about Stoicism?
Well, many think it's just as the military put it, suck it up and truck on. So it's about I fought really, really hard to make it as a woman. I just sort of mean.
Who's the funniest philosopher? Who would you say?
Uh,
Because most of them are quite serious.
yeah. So there was this guy named Polarism is not surprising in a world in which it's a black box of a sort. It's a mystery in there. I really don't know what I'm doing when I tap into the computer and all of a sudden everything spills out with AI.
On the show today, Nancy Sherman. So, Dr. Nancy Sherman, distinguished philosopher at Georgetown University, ethicist, background in moral philosophy. We're going to be talking Stoicism, Aristotle, probably touch on trauma and her work with the military, on moral injury. This woman is very wise, very well read, highly educated, and has a lot to say about topics that are normally covered very lightly with more depth, I would say. So, Nancy, welcome.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be here, Mark.
What do people misunderstand about Stoicism?
Well, many think it's just as the military put it, suck it up and truck on. So it's about enduring whatever the cost and without feeling much. So a sort of idea of being feeling less or suppress your feelings somehow and just get on with the business of the day and endure as toughly as you can. And I think that's a misread both of what Stoics are and what's healthy. So, in the sense of what Stoics are about, they definitely have a very rich account of emotions and how you should feel emotions. They also have a very rich account of staying connected with people that you care about and that are in your community. And they have, in addition, practical advice that isn't just about tuck in those feelings and move on with the work of the day. So I think those are all really important points. And so the Stoicism with a little s doesn't always capture that, but Stoicism with the big S tries to unpack some of that.
And do you want to say what you mean by the big S versus the little s?
So little s is a sort of a popularized notion. Which side of the channel it came from isn't clear. I actually have heard that it comes from our side. The idea of pull your socks up and stiff upper lip, and that is a common understanding of Stoicism with the little s, like stolid, sturdy would be synonyms. Stoicism with a big S was this important movement that covered from the death of Aristotle, so 323 before the Common Era, right to the second century of the Common Era. So about 500 years, right over the millennium, with lots of variation in the writers' points of view, but they had very complicated views about what your emotions are, how to train them, how to have better emotions, but not to get rid of them. So those would be some of the highlights, I think.
Mm. So Stoicism is a very broad church. So we're, painting in broad brushstrokes here. Everyone from emperors to slaves kind of writing about it. And then we're in between over 500 years, as you say. As a psychologist, it strikes me as very reminiscent of, and I believe influential on CBT, on the emphasis on sort of thoughts and emotions, kind of well ahead of its time in that sense. But I've been quite amused and occasionally disturbed, mostly pleased to see that it's really jumped into popular consciousness in the last, maybe just even the last 5 to 10 years. It seems like every time I go on YouTube, there's every man and his dog talking about Marcus Aurelius or the Stoics, Epictetus, and it's kind of a good thing in general, I think, but maybe with some downsides, right?
Yeah, so it is remarkably popular. I think part of the popularity is that it's easy to read. There's inspirational quotes, inspirational sayings. Epictetus was filled with zingers. He's trying to attract 18 to 22-year-olds of a sort, men typically, he himself being enslaved. And so he wanted his audience. And so he kind of knew how to get them in, if not with a hook, but with some jokes. Um, Marcus Aurelius, on the other hand, not at all enslaved, but in fact inspired by Epictetus, the emperor, he's thinking essentially about how do I survive one more year of war out there? So, and he's writing to himself. These were not at all meant to be published. They were meditations to oneself, to myself, written on the Danube when he was at war for 8.5 years. So he's not really thinking of drawing in an audience at all. He's not there to entertain. He's there to calm himself, I presume, as the emperor and supreme military commander, if you like, of the Roman Empire at that time, with a lot of his troops getting disease. The Antonine Plague was a version of a pandemic, even worse, probably, because there were no vaccines around, no advanced medicine. So, and he probably had it too. He's really thinking about calming himself. So it goes from being, I want to have an audience and I know about freedom, even though I was an enslaved person, because real freedom comes from within, to someone who really isn't thinking much about freedom, but is thinking about another day
Mm,
after
mm.
he wakes up in his tent.
So this is very pithy quality to some of the writers. It's almost like tweets, isn't it? It's certainly something you can almost put in an Airbnb on a poster or on a t-shirt. And I think that's part of the appeal, it's maybe you could say some of those quotes that people always quote around, it's thinking that makes the thing good or bad, which, Shakespeare takes on later. But there's also this practicality. Like a quick example, I'm in hospital today. I'm getting tested for what's potentially a very serious genetic disorder. And I go, you know what? I don't know the results. And I'm just observing my thinking and going, you know what? It may or may not be good. That's beyond my control. I've done everything I could. There's no point worrying about it more now. And also that sort of some of the techniques, like the playing it forward. Okay, if this does happen, let me sort of psychologically prepare for that. It's not the end of the world. This is something I'll cope with. So even from my day to day, that's fairly sort of stoic in the approach there, right? What I can and can't control, for example.
It's very stoic. So, Epictetus begins this tiny little uh, booklet, a pamphlet, maybe the size of Paine's pamphlet on Paine. And it's essentially begins with there are some things up to you and some things that aren't up to you. And then he goes on, as the Stoics do in general. Seneca is my favorite. I just think he's a brilliant writer and torn between his allegiance to Nero and his allegiance to himself. He was Nero's speechwriter and minister, but it tells you, well, how do you divide that line? Well, it's never very good at telling you how you divide the line, but it says, here are some of the practical methods for meditating or a technique for drawing that line. And one of the techniques is just as you said, anticipate the future. If this happens, then that. If it turns out badly, then I will think of what the next steps are for the next set of treatments or the next few days. If it turns out well, then I'll do that. And I'm always thinking here of the beginning of Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. So I think it's probably Virginia Woolf's mother that's the main character. They're in the Hebrides. You're British, so it's very, very rainy all the time. I've lived in Scotland. And she says to James, the young boy who wants terribly to go to the lighthouse, she says, if it doesn't rain, we'll go to the lighthouse. And he keeps saying, will we go to the lighthouse? If it doesn't rain, we'll go to the lighthouse. And so it's a kind of, if those are the conditions that are met, we'll go. But but it also, if it does rain, we have to have a backup plan. And it's a little bit like that. You're always thinking about planning in terms of outcomes that you like and what you do when there are outcomes that you don't particularly like. That's very practical. It's hard to come up with other ancient or modern philosophers in the whole, Western and I suspect Eastern corpus to some degree that have that kind of practical technique. And so I think
Yeah.
that's part of the appeal. It is made for the internet in many ways.
It's interesting looking at the Western versus Eastern philosophy slash praxis is that in the East is often yogas, right? This praxis is this things you can do, have a martial arts background, meditation background. And then a lot of Western philosophy feels quite theoretical. So people use the words like academic, or they'll say philosophical, meaning abstract, meaning not practical, not a technique you can use. So before we come to maybe some of the limitations again, are there any particular techniques you use daily or something you personally find helpful from Stoicism?
So I think the idea of, um, thinking a little bit about worst case outcomes and what you might do in that event, so that you are somewhat prepared. I also think, for example, they are talky, as you say, a little bit more, certainly more talky than Buddhists. They aren't about silencing your mind. Sort of, they were precursors in many ways to Freud. It's about talking out what's on your mind. But it can get a little too moralistic and moralizing, and so I try to avoid that. If I'm thinking about what went right or what went wrong during the day, I don't really want to moralize about it in the sense that, oh, they were a bad person and I was a good person, or I'm really guilty on this score. Just what happened. Well, so Seneca gives you an example, and I sometimes think of this. I wasn't seated at this is his example, but there's comparables. I wasn't seated at the head table near the guest of honor. I was put all the way in the back. And it clearly bugs him because it's on his mind at the end of the day. And so he's finding, as he says, as everything's quiet in the household, he kind of reviews it. Um, I guess one of the things I think about is you can review too hard through words what went right and what went wrong. And that's a problem, I think, that sometimes when you want to quiet your mind, you want to rid it of the rumination.
Hmm.
And ruminating on paper, or which Seneca does, he actually writes it, whether it's to himself or in letters, I think can get too much. So one of the important practices, as I think, is let stuff go if you just couldn't make a difference. Let it go. And knowing where that boundary is, where you did everything within your power to influence someone or to change an idea, or to make a point, or to, you know, vote for something in your, in your place of work, or in my case, in a department. And if it doesn't go that way, let it go without a lot of negative feelings. That's very Stoic, I think.
Yeah, the other side of the Serenity Prayer, there's a sort of yin and yang to it, isn't there? The
Mhm.
letting
Mhm.
go of what you can't control. Um, let's look at some of the issues here then. So clearly useful for a lot of people in the modern context. People, it reads as very modern in some ways when you read it. It's like, wow, this, Marcus Aurelius is talking about pulling up the bed covers and not wanting to get up in the morning. And I can imagine that. I have that every morning, at 6:30 when the alarm clock goes off. It's very helpful, very modern. But I guess there's a pretty cognitive approach here. And I am an embodiment teacher. I believe you swim and dance and have some physical practice yourself. The idea that we could just sort of think our way out of things, and then also you have a psychoanalytic background, right? So the idea that our thoughts are totally transparent to us, that revolution hadn't happened at this point. So any thoughts on the sort of limitation of thinking our way out of things?
Well, sure. Discourse can be evil, or, it can be, if not evil, really quickly turn into rumination. And rumination, we know, can get obsessive and sometimes neurotic. So, ways of thinking about this one actually helps, and it has to do with physical activity. So, I go swimming a lot, and I go locally at a Y. And for a long period of time, after school programs used it, and particularly some young French girls who I like to hear French, but sometimes they were gabbing away really hard in the locker room. And it's sort of the end of the day, 5 p.m. for me when I'm trying to wind down. I don't particularly want all the noise. And so I think about that a little in advance, and how, when I get into a lane swimming, it's going to kind of go away, meaning it's very hard to hear noise in a pool other than the splash and people doing their flip turns. So I think that a little bit of thinking in advance about what might happen, but not so hard that you don't get on with what you want to do and find the quietude you need is important. So, and physical activity obviously is a way to have a release. They don't talk much about that. That's not, there's a sort of a sense like sometimes Epictetus says, your body's like a donkey, and you carry around these saddlebags and bags for food and whatnot. Just let it go. Are you, think of yourself more as the groom taking care of, say, a horse in a stable. It's not you, it's just some other thing out there. So I don't believe that, because I don't believe that the body is some other part of your psyche, or it is, or some other part of your identity. But that was their way of making the divide. And one I think that we probably want to reject.
Mm-hmm. So, returning to something you pointed to earlier, there's a sort of macho, something that's called Broicism interpretation of just be tough it up, suck it up. I've heard you're at the Naval Academy, was it? And there's sort of, I can imagine the Navy SEAL saying stuff like that, or someone like Jocko, who's a big influence. These sort of influencers who come from special forces of just suck it up. And it strikes me that there's, on the one hand, a good intention in that. People can be quite fragile today. Certainly, it can be a masculine quality to a certain degree of just get on with it. I've got Australian colleagues who are very good at that, for example. And, sometimes it's helpful, but it's not a particularly sophisticated approach to emotional self-management. And there is a risk, isn't there, within that of a simple like self-brutality and pushing things down from a psychoanalytic point of view doesn't always end well. So, yeah, would you like to say a little bit more about that? The
Well,
risk of an unsophisticated
I
use.
worried hard about that, because I advised, for decades, I've advised the military, and I was at the Naval Academy during pretty tense times, and worked with SEALs and worked with people who really did um, think that they could just tough it out under any circumstances. And not just men, but women who really were oppressed by the situation, or even by outside influences. They were discriminated against, or refused promotions, or mocked, even when they graduate first in their class, for example, as one of my PhD students did at the Air Force Academy. And then went on to have these amazing careers with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But the idea that you just let it go, and maybe even promote the kind of ideas that they sometimes heard in some of the songs about toughing it up, got to them, to the point of it being disruptive psychologically. And I think it's an unhealthy method. Part of the reason I wrote an earlier book called Stoic Warriors was I really saw the blessings and curses of Stoicism. It was far too clear to me from people returning from Vietnam at very, very high level ranks, from the current midshipmen or cadets, that they were hurting terribly under the idea that they couldn't talk at all about their feelings. The feelings were just ruled out from the beginning. And I never wanted to see that in a fighting force, where being at the top of your game really matters, but it also matters how you take care of your troops, how you let others know that you're not feeling well, and being able to acknowledge that you're not feeling well, or that you need to talk it out with someone. Even, a chaplain who has anonymity, with whom you can keep your identity anonymous and it doesn't get reported. That was really, really important to me. So I wanted to make it
Mm.
absolutely clear. It was a time when creatine, I think, was still on the shelves in jars this big, huge. And then they got banned. This is a muscle building substance. And it was so obvious to me that I wanted something more than just toughness. If these, and some they were kids, 18 to 22-year-olds, or even 50-year-olds who had served in Vietnam, were going to make it through
Yeah.
through the next decade, especially leading troops. We were getting ready to go to wars.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. I mean, creatine's a fairly harmless muscle building supplement, but yeah, certainly in terms of sort of steroid use and things like that, people just toughing it out, not so smart. I mean, what I've loved about your work actually is the focus on the interpersonal aspect of resilience. So I sometimes say to the team in Ukraine, you're not resilient, you're inter-resilient. That
Mm.
we are relational creatures and the quality of our relationships is our resilience. And I wonder if that was almost a given in Greek culture, whereas we're in this much more hyper individualistic culture, where sort of the Stoic advice falls into the individualism of the modern West, and that relationality is perhaps lost.
I think that's really the case. I'll just go back for a second. So the Stoics come after Aristotle. Aristotle opens up the Nicomachean Ethics saying self-sufficiency isn't for us living alone. It's for us as a member of a family with brothers, sisters, spouses, fellow citizens. And it's relational. It sounds strange, but the very term to be in self-control, the Greek is self-control, is relational. And so that means your resilience, the endurance quality, depends on the sustaining support of others whom you trust and who you entrust in some ways with your care and vice versa. They you. And it gets and Aristotle is just keen on this. 2 out of 10 books in the Nicomachean Ethics are on friendship. That's really remarkable. They were kind of denied for a while because, or overlooked by British translators in some ways and scholars because they thought, where do I put this in a philosophy? But it's so clear that it's critical. The Stoics have that, but it gets diminished whether through our own lens, which, as you say, is hyper individualistic, or through um, the transmission. It's unclear, but the message often picked up is some things are within your control and some not. So you toughen up yourself to strengthen the areas of control. But Marcus Aurelius says at the beginning of Meditations, but they're probably not in the order that he probably didn't write them in the order they are now given in books. He says, if you've ever seen an arm and a hand and a leg and a head separated from the trunk, he's got the battlefield in mind, I suspect. You know what it is then to cut yourself off from humanity. That's remarkable. So few people pick that up as a through line in Stoicism, but to me, it is the through line that resilience is the sustaining and supporting um, and trusting of worthy others and worthy institutions in which you can invest your hope and your dreams. Um, Similarly, Seneca is always writing to a friend. He's not just writing to himself, he's writing to a friend, Lucilius, now who's his junior. Now, whether or not was a real exchange in this epistolary relationship, we don't really know. But he's thinking about the other. And, this is sort of in his retirement days when he's been banished by Nero, and he's probably going to face his death very shortly. It's a forced suicide. But also, he doesn't die alone. He wants to do it like Socrates, but they're all surrounded by their friends in the last moments. It's not a solo act. And so I think and we know psychologically, resilience among children, adults and you work with so many folks in Ukraine, we know that it depends on others. You just can't do it on your own. And if that gets blotted out in the way we tell the story of Stoicism, we are just being so unfaithful to the texts. So I think that's just sort of critical, and
Mm.
it's been the kind of bugaboo of my writing that when you say self-help, you sort of think about self as opposed to how am I situated in a partnership, in families, in business business ventures with others that I really like and can trust? And when do I bow out because they're undermining me?
Mm-hmm. Self-help as an idea is potentially narcissistic. As you say, it's historically inaccurate if we're really interested in Stoicism or Aristotle or any of these groups. And there is it's unhelpful in the sense that we're relational creatures, but it's also there's a political implication there, isn't there? And that it says, hey, you've got to do this on your own. It's not about the structures or systems. It's not about the position you're in. It's simply up to you. So pull your socks up. The problem isn't you're in poverty or whatever it's a systemic issue. The problem is you're not thinking right. So sort that out. So I mean, I'm kind of right leaning, but I see the truth in the kind of left position that there's real systemic structures that are really important for our resilience.
Well, you can't, I mean, no one survives on their own. We're not in islands, and if we were an island, we still need water, and someone's getting the water. I mean, there was a great Greek tragedy, Philoctetes, the guy gets marooned on an island for 10 years, and the only thing he's got is a sacred bow, and Odysseus, wants it from him and will do anything, trickster that he is, to get it. And he, and this guy, Philoctetes, marooned by his own troops, the Greeks, he's going to trust them because he needs to get out of that place and back to Greece. And so whether you're floating alone on a boat or you're working at your first job, unless you are living as a monk, and there certainly are those around who have found ways to survive on very, very little and on their own through thoughtful meditation, you are dependent on hundreds and hundreds of systems that often are invisible to you, but yet dependent upon them. And if they're not supported, then your own support or sustenance goes down the tubes. From healthcare to you know a partner with whom whose shoulder you can cry on, or children who have parents who they call when they're in need and want to sort things out. It certainly happens to me all the time with my family, and I look forward to the end of the day when I can debrief with my partner and we talk about the day and bolster each other up in ways we need to. If I have some really bothersome student, as sometimes happens, didn't show up for class, 4 times, what am I supposed to do there?
Yeah, I'm flying to Texas tomorrow, so I made sure I just got my travel insurance, which I don't need in Europe, because of the lack of healthcare. So it's cost me £100 more. Love it, love it.
Oh,
So
because you're the UK and you're no longer part of the EU.
yeah, I mean, I had a whole bunch of tests today, just paid for by taxes, and when I'm in the States, I have to make sure I got knocked off a scooter last time I was in Austin, and my first thought was I can't afford this, and that shouldn't be your first thought while getting run over by someone jumping a red light. Anyway, um, let's go to moral injury. So this is a term some listeners might not know, and
Sure.
you've been deeply involved with this work within the military. You visited Guantanamo Bay. Let's talk about moral injury. I think it's a fascinating term.
It's a really, really important term. Um, and it actually has a history that goes much further back. Butler, 18th century, 17th century British, who talked about resentment and the idea that you got hurt by someone dissed you in some way or other. But moral injury is, when it's more severe, is a kind of trauma. It's a moral trauma. And the trauma is triggered, if you like, or the threat isn't so much a life threat, but it could be. There's certainly tons of overlap, which is what post-traumatic stress disorder was first understood to be about in 1982 when the diagnosis came out in the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, the DSM, that mental health providers use in the United States. But moral injury was rather when the threat was a threat to your moral sensibility, a threat to your conscience. You felt like you didn't do everything you could have and should have done. That could have and should have kind of conversation. So you're plagued with this horrible sense of guilt. I should have warned my troops that there was a likelihood of an IED there in that area. I shouldn't have allowed someone to, to jump out of the Humvee and go try to relieve himself over there, because I should have known there was something there and someone gets blown up. Or you're so ashamed that your troops or maybe country has done something, or that you can't help what's going on. It's a sense of moral devastation in some ways, a kind of shattering of your moral conscience and your moral psyche, you might say. And it overlaps with post-traumatic stress disorder in that they're both very traumatic. And the drugs may be very similar, and you may have nightmares. You may get hypervigilant when there are similar triggers, bumps in the road, if it was an IED that that you should have prevented from going off in some way, or someone losing their life at. And so, um, and also dissociation, like you don't want to, you want to retreat. I want to play video games for 20 hours. I don't want to talk to any, or I want to self-medicate. My best time is when I'm drinking or when I'm on drugs. And you hope that there are people that can intervene. And so understanding moral injury and being able to talk about it at whatever centers they are. I work very closely with folks at the VA, the Veterans Administration hospitals across the country. They need to hear the signs of that. Maybe it's a letter written to someone long gone, but maybe it's an enemy troop who when you saw the body, you pulled out a wallet and there was the kids, pictures of the kids and pictures of a wife, and you think, oh my God, they, like me, had a family, and it haunts you for 50 years, but you lock it up in the lockbox, you put it away, and it comes back in nightmares. To be able to think about that in a safe environment with a trusted counselor is worth everything. And it's often that maybe it's in writing a letter to that, someone in Okinawa, and that you sort of enjoy. I'm talking World War II because I've heard these stories. My father carried his dog tags till his dying day, and he died in his late 80s. And I was the closest of daughters. He was a medic during World War II. Was on the Queen's QE2 and the Queen Mary that went back and forth to New York City from Scotland, from the Clyde. And he saw things he never wanted to see again, ever. And he carried his dog tags on his chain, his keychain. And I never saw it. I kind of was oblivious to it, though, when I had to clean up his effects in the hospital after his death, it was there. And I kind of realized my dad never wanted to talk about what clearly bothered him throughout his life and probably haunted our family in some way. We lived through Vietnam. He lived through Korea. He lived through Vietnam. He lived through other wars. And it was probably always there, but it was taboo. So those are powerful memories that can be traumatizing. And they're not only about, I almost lost my life. My dad didn't almost lose his life. He was safe in Scotland, or safe on a hospital boat that was going back and forth over the Atlantic. But he clearly thought he didn't do enough to save many people whose lives were threatened through that war.
It's interesting that psychology tends to stay away from ethics and morality in a way that philosophy doesn't. Whereas there's not really a separation, as you say. In my experience, people have the worst PTSD. It's a sense of I'm powerless, but my friend died, and I should, the morality. I should have been able to save him, or they shouldn't have tortured me, or I had to be a witness to these things, and I'm immoral because I didn't stop, I didn't jump in when I perhaps could have done, or it strikes me that morality is something that sort of in our postmodern culture we pretend isn't a thing. And it sounds almost old-fashioned or very sort of conservative to say this is immoral or moral things. But philosophers have no problem with that. And it's absolutely key to Aristotle, right? To talk about morality and ethics.
Yeah. So It wasn't until William James came along in America, at least. So that's Harvard around turn of the 20th century, 1900-ish, that philosophy and psychology got separated. He made it psychology more of an experimental science. And but he himself, was a bit of a philosopher. Clearly, lots of people read William James for philosophy. So the division between psychology and philosophy is quite new in the history of thought. It's also many people who are in the business of talk therapy go to therapists to talk and work out things, are talking about things that have to do with failures of responsibility, or at least perceived failures of responsibility, if not real, wishes they could have altered some situation better than they did, children who don't quite turn out the way they want to, or have drug problems or the like. There's we assume a lot of responsibility. We take it on ourselves, and sometimes it's falsely ascribed to ourselves. We didn't really have the power. Stoicism tries to help there. You really didn't have the power to change things. But it is about responsibility, and whether it's misplaced or not, it's felt deeply. And that is the advantage of psychologists in some ways. They care about what you're feeling, even if you're kind of misreading a situation. In cognitive behavioral therapy, especially with rape victims, for example, who suffer terrible, terrible trauma, all they can relive is the thought, I did something wrong. I should have done it differently. I should have been walking on that street at that moment. My dress was too short. I wasn't carrying, I was always taught when I was in graduate school, carry your keys between your knuckles and be ready to, right through the eyes. And, I wasn't doing that, something like that. And so the ascription of responsibility is pretty strong, often overly strong, but it gives you a sense that most of us, not all, I have to say, most of us want to be good people. We want to take care of other people. Sometimes we draw the boundaries too tight, and sometimes we're willing to go outside the comfort zone and lend a hand when people look really differently from ourselves, or in different walks and in different circles. And that's, I think, what it is to be human. Morality is just about what's human. We're lucky we have psychological methods, drugs, brain imaging, fMRIs, and everything else that can happen through more advanced neurology, and the in my country, the FDA testing drugs regularly to see, okay, which antidepressants really work, which one help with anxiety, which one help with addiction, how do we deal with alcoholism addictions and stuff like that. Philosophers aren't too good on that. Someone like in the time of the Stoics, there's this guy, a Roman guy, Fundanus, who says, abstain, abstain. What is Stoicism like? It's like abstention.
Yes.
Abstain, abstain, abstain. It's one more day of drink, 2 more days of no drink, 3 more days of no drink, 4 more days of no drink. That's what it's like to be able to have, the strength of abstention. But it's not just your will. We now know, there's a lot going on biochemically that isn't just about your goodness.
Yeah, as a
A
long-term.
combination of both is really, really critical. But also the ability to say, you know what, I need help.
Yes.
To help someone to get help. That is so critical. I have lost people through, in some cases, suicide, and other cases, failures of institutional medicine, because of the poverty of the institutions. And it's heart-wrenching to see that when you think you could have done something otherwise to help someone.
Hmm. I had a grandfather who fought on D-Day, and for years afterwards, he'd wake up screaming and sweating with PTSD. And you'd ask him in the morning how he was, and he'd say he was fine. And he clearly wasn't fine. And I wonder if we've both been impacted by, your father. I mean, you're called Sherman, for God's sake. I mean, that's, I don't know
Someone
if
said that to me yesterday. I was going to the I was dropping something off of the shoemaker, and I know that the guy there was a former Marine, and he said, "Oh, what's your name again?" Sherman, Sherman tank. And I said, that was a taunt in childhood, nothing to do with the tank. He said, "I can't really help it. I'm a military guy."
Mm, mm. And one thing the Greeks were big on, certainly Aristotle, virtue ethics, the idea of building virtue. And that seems to have disappeared from the public space. Occasionally I was around some scouts the other day who had a bit of a narrative in Czechia, but generally it's not part of the normal educational narrative. It's maybe in the military, but not elsewhere. And I find a lot of boys particularly feel very lost without a sense of how do I build virtue? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. There was a period, maybe about 20 years ago, there was a program out there called Character Counts. And it was a leadership program of a sort. And I was called in to train and then to give some programs on it, and they would list pillars, I think was the, pillars of virtue. And they were pretty common ones: integrity and courage and honesty. And if you think about them without using that Latin word, virtus, which comes from the masculine, actually, but the Greek is excellence. The Greek is just what came to us through Latin as virtue. In Greek was called arete, and it's just excellence, but the excellence of your psyche, of your character. And that's a much better read on it, I think. And they're things that matter in terms of your goodness. Like, I'm working on a book called How to Have a Soul, and meaning how to have a good soul. And there are things like courage, um, things like honesty, caring about the truth, um, caring about being generous to others when you have enough for yourself and so enough to give to others. Things like, and courage doesn't have to be military. It can simply be a state of mind about how am I going to get up tomorrow, or how do I face death? How do I face mortality? Which is, for many, takes a lot of courage, and there's a lot of denial that can go on. And so, the it's such a common place. You couldn't raise children if you, to my mind, decent children. The word is decent, good and decent. In Greek, they kind of go together. They always are sort of linked. And when they're talking about character or virtue, it's really decency. And what do you think about when you think about being decent? You think about, how do you treat others? How do you think about something other than what's in it for me? And that really is critical. When I get into a classroom and I teach, I really am not about, what kind of ratings am I going to get today from my students? I just care about, are they getting the ideas, and do they want to keep learning? And they want to do the reading, but not just to please me, but so they can improve their understanding of the material. So I think they're really, really basic. I think out there in the public market and in the public area, whether it's narcissism or grandiosity or the values of making money above everything else at any cost, that really, really diminishes the goodness of character. So I think character, that's what it's about. Having a decent and good character. What kind of character would you like your kids to have? What do
Mm.
you want to mirror before them when you wake up in the morning?
Aristotle had this lovely sort of idea of the golden mean of sort of between two extremes. So somehow strikes me with, like you say, with the Stoicism again, right? We've got on the one hand kind of like macho Broicism, but on the other, there's something like sort of, overly sensitive Californianism or something. There's another extreme there. And yeah, could you say something about that? Because it's very moderate, and the internet is so full of extremes who are saying the young guys, you've got to be really hardcore, really extreme, do more, harder, faster, stronger. And there's something in that moderation that just seems sane to me.
Well, so Aristotle, that, just sort of a point, Aristotle does have this idea of the mean, but it's not really a midpoint, because you can't, there's nothing in life is that simple. There's this and there's that, and you're going to go in the middle. And he backs off that to do it at the right way, the right time, for the right reason. But it's so easy, especially if you're given a few words only, to pump something out there, get something out there, to go black or white. So polarism is not surprising in a world in which there's only so many characters in a tweet, and you're trying to get an audience. It's a recipe
Yeah.
for
The
simplification.
algorithm brings that out even more, right? Like
Oh,
it pumps up, it magnifies, amplifies the more extreme voices for sure.
absolutely. But nothing that's worth doing in life, whether it's how much weight, this morning I couldn't lift the usual weight I lift because I realized I've torn some of my shoulder. I don't have I don't need a rotator cuff replacement, but I definitely have tears in my shoulder, which I know an MRI revealed. So it showed up when I tried to lift weights, a certain amount of weights, and it was not the same on the left. You could see the disparity. Now, if I'm just trying to bench lift a certain amount, who I am, what I need, what's right for me never enters. It's just some competition. And you're either there or not there. But life is never like it. Life is messy. Life is gray. Life is about hard decisions. Life is about delicate decisions. Who would ever be black and white with a really smart adolescent child, who can argue to bits and pieces? And you don't want to, at a certain point, you might want to close off the conversation, but you have to get into some nuance about different people. The internet does not allow for nuance, and it does not allow for deep dives, long form articles.
Yeah. Yes.
That's even a thing of the past.
That's one reason people like podcasts, I think, 'cause you actually have time to have a conversation and flesh things out. I love your passion there, Dr. Sherman, your sort of oomph. Does that come from the weightlifting? Does it come from being around the military academies? Were you born with that kind of spirit?
Well, some of it is, I'm of a generation where I fought really, really hard to make it as a woman. I just sort of mean, if you're in the States, colleges were almost all male. The Ivy League was almost all male. I think Yale opened up the year after, the year I went, or the year after. Uh, so, I went to an all women's school, which was absolutely top. And then I ended up going to graduate school, and my sort of did very, very well. But I remember being in rooms at Harvard where the only thing I could see were men looking down from portraits. And it annoyed me to all hell. And I worked with other individuals. I mean, we also saw blatant discrimination. So there's a period in which it was really, really important. And I knew I was bright. I knew I really cared about ideas. And so I just, worked on it. I suspect there were others comparable to myself who didn't have that same passion, or parents who didn't think that was the right way to go. And it certainly didn't come from a position of wealth, because I certainly didn't have wealth as a child growing up, or throughout most of my life. So that it wasn't having a golden, silver spoon in my mouth that that brought me to that. So some of it is just absolute passion, that people with ability should be able to do things. And I feel very, very strongly that, I have a daughter who's an athlete. I mean, a very serious athlete, a competitive athlete, and swam.
Women too, right? Yeah.
Yeah, swam um, in the Ivies for, and she's continued it in freezing water, makes the North Sea almost look warm, and where she's the bay. And um, she's sort of a toughie. So, but I work out because it's really fun, and it's a way of releasing a lot of energy at the end of the day. And I've always felt that, whether it was, um, when I was very, very young. Although I have to say, I almost didn't pass my gym class as an undergraduate because I got mono, and then I couldn't really throw a ball. That was one thing I wasn't taught well. I threw like a girl.
It's nice to talk to a philosopher that's got a strong body background. And maybe let's talk a little bit more about that. And you did a section in Stoic Wisdom on this where you sort of talk about weights or swimming, particularly cold water or whatever. These are potentially Stoic practices. And sometimes it gets a bit silly with the ice baths and things like that. But people are, they're seeking some kind of deliberate difficulty to sharpen their virtue on in some sense. So, what's your sense of that? Is it possible? Is it overrated? Talk to us about that.
Discipline is really important, whether it's sitting down to write your great novel, or whether it's waking up and working out, or doing it at the end of the day. I've just always thought of it as going hand in hand. They weren't like two separate things. It wasn't as if I was gonna, I'm only gonna sit for 12 hours to meet this deadline, and then do something. I really can't sit that long. And my mind works much better if my body works well. So I often, I can't run anywhere because of bad knees, but I often go out for, fast walks so I can unload my head. I can't stand going to a dinner table or out to dinner if I haven't had a chance to be in my own zone. Not listening to music, not listening to a podcast, I have to say, but just decompressing. And I think we do that best through physical activity. Blow off some steam.
Mm, mm,
Your care of your body in the same way you view, whatever your walk is, the way you view other parts, other jobs in your life, whether it's being at a desk or managing many people. I just think it's of the same sort. It's just not two different things. It's certainly, being a gym rat these days has become a thing. I have my own gym in my home, but I don't have my own pool, that's for sure. So
yeah.
I'm out there with others.
Well, the gym's my happy place. I know a lot of the guys who listen to this
Yeah,
have
yeah, it is a
just
happy
got
place.
the
Yeah.
challenge of it. I'm going to be in Ryan Holiday's bookshop at the weekend, so if I bump into him, I'll tell him I'm pretty sure you could beat him in a fight. By the way, Doctor. So, but
Fine holiday is everything.
I'm pretty sure you could beat him up. So, what do you think of some of these popularizers like Ryan Holiday's wrote some some good books. He's always on the podcast. Yeah, what do you think?
I mean, I think Brian has done a very good idea in getting stuff out. And I know a little bit about where he came from and why he got into it, and how he found some salvation in a certain way in returning to the Stoics, given his experience with, I mean, it's public, with American Apparel and his boss. And so it was really like a moral crisis for him. And for many, there is that feel about it. And for some of the followers, I do think it is an alternative to religious going.
Hmm.
It's a church, a synagogue, a mosque of a sort. It's a place that's secular, that seems somewhat familiar to things that they know, and so there it resonates. And that's actually quite good, and you don't have to pay dues or have allegiance to certain kinds of dogmas you might have to have with an institution. And there's a sense of liberation, maybe from your past. In the case, I've talked to so many people who were devout X, Y, or Z and aren't devout anymore. And it was a really hard reckoning. But now they've found Stoicism. And we got to remember that the period is overlapping with the um the major the major religions in the States. It overlaps with Christianity and Judaism, turn of millennium,
Hmm.
um and with Islam as well, to some degree. So it is not surprising to me at all that people are looking for an alternative. Is it money making? Yes, on his on Holiday's part, absolutely. is
Very
was
much
he
so. Yeah.
Was he a salesperson before? Yes, he was the sales, he was a sales guy. So he brings with it that background. Does he have a army of researchers? Yes, I wish I had that army of researchers who could get me, just the example he wants of courage at a certain moment. And I'm sure he's got an army of others. So he uses a lot of his wealth garnered through his podcasts to amplify the sound a little bit. Do I get annoyed a little bit at someone who has coins that are supposed to look like military coins that you can order online? I mean, I've been given hundreds of military coins that I don't know, it's a thing. Officers often slip them in your hand when they shake your hand as a thank you for your service. And I've certainly been given them and I treasure them. I don't think I would ever buy one that has, Marcus Aurelius or
Mm, mm,
Epictetus on it.
mm.
So, like anything where you're getting the message out, you're often doing it with a bit of for lucrative stuff, So you're asking an academic.
Yeah, that struck me as a very fair, balanced, and somewhat diplomatic answer, but I felt that was generous. And I do notice this tension. So I have all sorts of people on the show. Just to give you an idea, I've interviewed over 600 people, and some of them are very much academics. Philosophy professor from Oxford we had on recently, for example, Stephen Law. Others are much more popularizers, or people like me who are trainers. We're very much on teachers more than academics, and
Yeah,
then some that are sort of in the middle. And there is a bit of a tension there. And I on sort of academics at their worst seem to be a bit defensive of their territory. And they're like, but you haven't gone to Oxford. How dare you have an opinion? And then, the popularizers at their worst are sort of cashing in. And I'm glad there's both in a way, but there is a tension in the personal growth field between these two groups of people, I've noticed.
that's absolutely the case. And of course, there's crossover because straight up epic. Well, one of my advisors, John Rawls, probably wrote the most influential political philosophy of the 20th century. I can't ever imagine him or Marcus Sen getting on podcasts. It
Mm,
wasn't their
mm,
era, but they had a different mission, a totally different mission. Um, but there's now crossover in the idea that there are people hungry for ideas. They're really, really hungry for ideas. And they may not, be up for 4 hours every night reading something. Or or the TV series have just, they're tired of watching The Crown or Succession or something like that. They want something else. And so they're moving on. And so I totally get and I think it's laudable to be able to spread idea outside the academy when you're not in those ivory towers. Totally, totally get it. And, so academics try to sell their wares. Sell is the wrong thing, but influence a bit in ways that we think can
mm,
enlighten
mm.
without cheapening the ideas, and being true to who we are. Some people would never do this. So
Mm, mm. Yeah, and some interview well, like yourself, and some could be great academics who just don't fit into that format of, being able to interview or whatever it is. And it strikes me there's a bit of a battle for authority going on in the world. The academy has lost a lot of trust with a lot of people. Science has trust, but has also lost it. Like people still love the neuroscience of, Stoicism or whatever. The East has a certain authority, but again, the gurus have lost that. The Buddha said this. There's that sort of appeal to authority in the more new agey personal growth world, or the Native Americans. That's another appeal to authority you'll get. And it strikes me that there's a sort of slight war going on. It doesn't seem to be well established who has the best take on truth. And I don't know how
oh,
that
that's really true.
compared.
Yeah, that's true. So I heard a really interesting lecture yesterday by a guy, a colleague who works on AI, which we all use it because all you have to do is open up Chrome and go to Google, and they have their own
Sure.
version of AI that's giving you an answer in a nanosecond. And the point of this lecture was about transparency. I have no idea, you know, I have no idea. Most of the designers have no idea exactly how it works. So it's a black box of a sort. It's a mystery in there. So the question, but we give deference to it because it's really fast in the way that we used to give, you're talking about authority, deference to authority. We knew who the authorities were. In the 12th century, they were the monks in the at Oxford. We knew who the authorities were, the founding fathers or something like that. But with this, just like we don't really, unless we're a neurologist, we really don't understand, what's going on with an fMRI, a functional magnetic resolution imaging. Even computer scientists, data dudes, really don't know what's going on with these neural networks that DeepMind and Google's DeepMind are working on, or all the other AI places around. And the idea is, should we? Well, yeah, I think we should. We should know it. I don't really want to give deference to science unless, well, I mean, I can't understand, infectious disease in the way Dr. Anthony Fauci can, but I give him deference because I know his credentials. And I trust the guy. And I know science makes mistakes. It doesn't
Yeah,
get
yeah.
everything
I
right away.
disagree with you on that one, but with that
It
particular
doesn't get everything right away.
for
The
sure.
flu, you can have a flu vaccine and you still can get the flu 3 months later. Whoever said it would be 100%. That said, I know how to rely on authorities that have credentialed. I really don't know what I'm doing when I tap into the computer and all of a sudden everything spills out with AI. And
Mm,
most of the makers don't know it either. They
no,
do
no, it's beyond their
not know the
control. No
neural
one knows.
networks. Yeah.
It strikes me that maybe that's why people are getting interested in philosophy again, because they're sort of going back to first principles to understand things at that slightly deeper cut for themselves. And this is, to go back to Aristotle, I've heard you describe him as your first love. This idea of wisdom. So we need in an information swamped world, what's the meta skill? It's wisdom, right? And this was one of his key things.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, absolutely. So he thinks that the flip side, it's not the flip, the other side of virtue, which has two dimensions, is you're having an intellect that's wise, which is wisdom. And that's what the sage is all about. But unlike the Stoics, Aristotle really thinks the sage, or the person of practical wisdom, is the person who is through and who does the right thing, but also has the right emotions. So it's a kind of like your emotional demeanor and your conduct and how you present yourself in everyday life, that kind of thing. That's a part of being wise. It's like your social interaction is a part of wisdom. And it's not wisdom like I'm going to go to a mountaintop and take some vows and I'll be up there for 10 years, goodbye, and I'll see you later and I'll come back down and give you the truth. That's not his view at all. It's that you're stuck in the world and you're working on it and you're being decent to other people, not just through what you do, charitable givings, but how you interact with them, what shows on your face, what shows on your hands. Like the full body gets into wisdom, and that's very exciting to me. It's a full picture of the human being as not a god and
Mm,
not of some separated intellect, whatever that could even be.
messy and in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, Aristotle also talks a lot about practice, right? Which is a huge one for the gym guys listening and the embodiment people listening. Like this idea of having to practice something, not just to read a book on it.
Yeah. So he says you become just by doing just deeds, and you become just like you become a good lyre player, which is a harp, by playing. So, I thought about this a lot when I was younger, and I thought, I tried to get my kids to get to the piano. I never was successful. And I told them, well, you got to practice, practice, practice. And, that didn't get me very far. And so the idea of practice is it's mindful practice or critical practice. You're thinking as you're doing, and this goes for how you're lifting weights or what your form is when you're dancing or swimming. How am I entering the water? Am I actually pulling with my arm or is it just sitting there? I see people swim, their arms are like this, or they're, all the water goes through their finger, and I'm thinking, oh my God, their technique is terrible. So it's not just do and do and do, it's do and get it better each time, improve and know how to improve. And that's, I think, a lesson for life, whether you're thinking about, writing a newspaper article and how you can get that first paragraph better than it ought to be, than you might have had it. I go through millions and millions, not millions, but drafts and drafts and drafts of chapters. Or you're lifting weights and you kind of look in the mirror and your form is horrific, like your glutes aren't tight, your you're not pulling your shoulders back, which I always have to do to get the whatever those calls, the rom zone, whatever these things are called,
Jesus.
yeah, to get them in, get my wings back properly,
Oh, the lats, yeah.
my shoulders down, and stand up really tall. And if I need some assistance, I don't mind at all, or go down and wait.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm British, so my glutes are always tight, but we're known for that. Um, as we start to move towards close here, you've had quite a life in terms of the practical experience. It's not everyone that gets to sort of meet Navy generals and meeting Stockdale and
Navy admirals.
Navy admirals. Excuse me. My family
For
army.
any military out there.
My family are army. We don't have any Navy in my family. And Air Force, but yes. So you've met the hell of people, been to Guantanamo Bay, had a whole life. You're a grandmother, I believe, as well. So you've really had the whole life here. What strikes you as sort of wow? Those were pivotal experiences to my understanding of philosophy.
Well, certainly my education was unbelievable. Thank you, scholarships all the way through. And being in Britain, actually, I have to say, was pretty remarkable. I lucked out in being able to see a different culture from my own, and so it was really formative years, as well as meeting a husband in Edinburgh. um, that said, I think the the beginning 3 years, mid 90s, in which I served in the military, I was kind of, everyone said, you must be an admiral. We'll stick you in 1-star housing wherever you go. I wasn't, of course, but I came from a generation where the Vietnam War just tore a country apart, very much like where we are now, but now it's amplified because of the way social media works and the way there are echo chambers and conspiracy online and stuff like that. But for me, working with individuals who were so different from myself, who flew airplanes over the Mekong Delta, meeting Jim Stockdale, who was the senior POW in what was called the Hanoi Hilton, alongside John McCain, and survived for 7.5 years by having memorized Epictetus, essentially. um, Seeing people so different from myself and making an influence on their lives, and moreover, they making a huge influence on mine. I think that was like the gift of a lifetime. So, and it was sort of academic, of course. I stood up a course on ethics. I trained them. I trained SEALs. I did a lot of stuff that I never ever would have thought I could do with my background. And it opened the world up to me, made me much wider thinking. I understand much better, what is it to be a 4-star? What is it to have that kind of decorum and know what to say and how to do it, and to also really, really be worried about other people. I mean, that's what they do when they do it best. They are worried, they care for each other, and they care for troops. I mean, a lot of them are chasing ribbons and stars and all that kind of craziness, but many really go in because of service, and you just feel it in spades. And for me to teach alongside those people and sort of also see their sacrifices and losses, I've lost individuals over
Mm.
this period. I've seen horrible, horrible stories. I've seen people I've trained PhDs in philosophy, who are colonels, who are generals, that kind of thing. It's really an amazing experience. So I think, that is, and that of course, but also being raising your own kids in my case, but also having grandkids and sort of remembering how much fun it is to play. sheer play. You can do a cartwheel, girl. I can't believe it. And I do it like you can, all of that stuff, running with kids. I mean, the sheer exuberance and wanting to make a better world for them. So I think about that almost every day. I want the climate to be better for future generations. I want my students to be better for future generations. So I've been in a position, whether it's personal or professional, where I've been able to think beyond my own pocketbook and beyond my own family, that kind of thing. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, pretty cool. Pretty cool. Woo! Lots there. What's there? Yeah.
You're
Sometimes
asking
like
very good questions, so I get to compliment you now.
I've enjoyed researching you tremendously using AI and listening to many other interviews. I had lots of good content. You've been in my ear at the gym today. Some fun one I sometimes ask people before wrapping up is often guests get interviewed, they get asked the same old questions. What is Stoicism? What's Jim Stockdale like? So is there any question you wish you got asked more about, a topic you wish you got asked more about in interviews that would be kind of fun just to kind of rip on for a little bit before we close?
Yeah, so why should we care about play? For a while, I really was thinking about play. Because philosophy is a serious business. We talk about justice and we talk about good character, but what about fun? And so I've thought a lot about, well, what do the ancients think about it? Sometimes they just think it's, recreation is respite from other more important, sorry, the sun's in up my eye here, respite from more important activities, but it's not much on its own. It's child's thing, toys, spinning tops and stuff like that. But I actually think it's really, really more important. It's laughing. I'm not particularly funny. I have a husband who's really, really funny. And enjoying wit is, that isn't harmful, not harmful wit, but wit that's just, like spot on. That's fun. And so putting humor and fun, play with it's all its creativity, spend time with a kid on the floor, building blocks or Legos or have their eyes open up. Wow, you can do that. You should see this. I can't wait to show you. That is just so cool. The sheer excitement that comes and curiosity of discovery that is part of play as adults or as children. If you lost that as an adult, then just,
Mm.
pack up your bags. It's really not worth it. Sometimes I try to tell a joke or two in class. Sometimes they come off well, sometimes they don't, but sometimes a student, who's not too cynical will say, "That's a good one, Professor Sure."
You'll get one in. I'm known as the world's funniest trauma teacher, which is a funny claim to fame in
That's
my.
it. Well, that's a
The,
relief.
the
It's good.
Ukrainians are dry in their humor, who I've taught as well. I love
Do
their
you
dialogue.
speak Ukrainian? I mean, do you speak their language or do you
Speak
have
some
translators?
Russian. My Ukrainian's pretty bad, but mostly it's run by the team of people I train now. So I train them in English, and they do the hard work now. I just talk to them every now and again, just text them once a week, make sure they're doing okay, give them a bit of supervision, a bit of love, hear about their boyfriends, and encourage them not to put themselves too close to the front line. Is the big worry I have some days. But
Of course, of course.
yeah, talking about moral responsibility, putting young people
That's a
in
lot. That's
line,
heavy.
that's
Very
sort of
heavy.
weighs with me a bit. But who's the funniest philosopher? Who would you say? Like, because most of them are quite serious.
Yeah. So there was this guy named Ted Cohn, who was at University of Chicago,
Ah,
and he wrote a book called Jokes or something like that. And he went through a ton of them to try to analyze through sort of philosophy of language a bit why they were funny. And some of them were very, very funny. I've been in seminars with him and he could be just a stitch. So that, that was pretty funny. I don't know who else would be rather funny. Trying to think, I wasn't blessed with enough of them. But Stanley Cavell was a guy who thought he was going to really be a musician, like a jazz musician, but fell in love with movies. He snuck out from piano lessons. He got into Juilliard and ended up going to movies in the afternoon. And so he would show movies, and that was a great relief, like Bringing Up Baby. That's a Katharine Hepburn movie. I mean, these were old Cary Grant, Hepburn movies, but they were really, really fun. And watching movies in a philosophy class, that can be great fun.
Could be
Or
good.
having the privilege to listen to someone who's pretty brilliant talking
Mm.
about a movie you like, that was great fun.
Yeah, I was never sure if Nietzsche was joking when he sort of had chapters like "Why I Write Such Good Books," but I think maybe he wasn't joking. It was just a megalomaniac. It's hard to know, but that struck
He's
me as
a weird guy. Yeah,
kind
yeah.
of odd. Yeah. Listen, we needed to wrap up. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Sherman, for your time. Much appreciated. Where do people find your books, your stuff online? Where's the place to go?
Okay, good. So nancysherman.com. You can click on that and there will be other media stuff and books, whatever your favorite bookstore is. But Amazon has all of them, and Stoic Wisdom is in recorded books, and I'm not reading it. And also, is online, is a ebook, that kind of stuff. So they're there. But that's a good place if you're interested in more military stuff. Afterwar is available, as well as Stoic Warriors, as well as Untold War.
Yeah.
So
After those interested in trauma and moral injury after war seem to be big.
absolutely, there's
Yeah.
a lot of
Yeah.
that
A lot of
there.
depth there.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Mark. A really fun conversation.